Welcome everyone. Today I'm going to talk about Azure DNS and I'm going to focus primarily on private zone. So we have in Azure DNS two kind of DNS zones. One is public, another is private. Public is pretty straightforward. We'll probably cover it in another short video, but this is where we're going to spend most of our time understanding the private DNS zone, how the Azure virtual machine and virtual network in a private VNet kind of scenario can talk to each other using the private DNS, which doesn't have a public entity, hence it is not exposed to the internet and fully secure and fully protected, but can leverage the full power of DNS. How you can build that, what happens when you do not have it, and then how Azure handles that DNS is the first thing which we're gonna first touch on to let you know what exactly happens behind the scene and how you can really alter that behavior on your own. So let's see that. To do that, let me show you a small little diagram, and then this is already deployed today, so you can see that we have now two virtual machine here. One is this virtual machine and this is a second virtual machine. Both of them are deployed in Azure under a virtual network, and they are in a subnet. They can be a different subnet in the VNet, and they get a different private IP address. So these are all private IP addresses, so they're not accessible over internet. And if you, let's say, log into one of these VMs and then ping the other VM, it is answerable. So let's see that from a portal experience, how that looks like, and then we'll move on from here to the next part of our demo. So to understand that, let me first log into my Azure portal. Okay. So if I go to the Azure portal now, in the Azure portal, I have already created two VMs and they are up and running. Hopefully you'll be able to see what are the IP addresses they are offering. So if I go here in this Azure portal, and then if you can see here in my Azure portal, I have got a virtual machine called VMUBU. That stands for Ubuntu, and it has got a public IP address and a private IP address. So you will see that soon that it's gonna go ahead and display it here. Let me just refresh this page. And you have this public IP address through which you can do an SSH to this VM and then play around with it. And it has a private IP address called 10.0.0.4, which you can only use when you are part of the virtual network, which everybody is aware of. And then if you notice here the other virtual machine, maybe I open another tab so that I don't have to close one to show the other one, is another VM called VMUBU2. That's Ubuntu 2. So that's already created, and it should have another public IP address which we are not worried about too much, but it has a private IP address called 10.0.1.4. So if I may go in one of these VMs, so let me just open the local terminal, and if I just try to log into this VM, I think it's already logged in. So let's use this VM. Let's probably reduce the size of the VM here. So what I can do, I can say ping localhost to see if it can ping its own machine. So it's 127, that's fine. If I say ping 10.0.0.4, that's this machine, right? You can see that it can reach to its own machine, private IP address from within the machine. That's fine. That's obvious behavior. But if I say like 10.0.1.4, which is another virtual machine, that is VM Ubu 2, but in the same VNet within that. So it should also be able to connect if that other VM is up and running. So it's all connected. Both the VMs are running fine and working okay. Now, what happens in the application world, we don't use these IP addresses to connect to each other. We give a name, right? And what that's why we need DNS, and DNS is a hidden service which always keep up and running within the Azure context, even if you do not have a private DNS zone set up explicitly, right? So what Azure really does is that it has a name to the VM, and using a hidden DNS, it gives a DNS endpoint and through which you can reach out to that VM. You don't need an IP address. So let's see that experience. So if you say ping, and then you say that VM, you who, let's use this own VM, and I say internal.cloudapp.net. It basically will help you reach out to its own VM. You can see that it's now resolving to 10.0.0.4. That's the internal IP address to this VM, right? That's absolutely fine. Now, if I change this VM name to the second VM, that is VM Ubuntu, now it will reach out to 10.1.0.4. So this is an IP address which is basically being provided by this DNS, which is always there with you for Azure. So that IP address of the DNS is 168.63.129.16. You cannot ping this IP address, it's not routable, but it acts as a DNS for all the resources you create within Azure, especially the virtual machines within the VNet, and gives a DNS endpoint to those machines so that you can talk to each other, right? You don't have to use the internal IP address to interact with each other. So just imagine that you have a database in the second VM. Instead of calling it using 10.0.1.4, you call it using vmubu2.internal.cloudapp.net. It can still be able to resolve. And if the internal IP changes, let's say you restart the VM or deallocate the VM, and then the VM is up and again running again, it might get another IP address, internal IP address. So that IP specific connection might not work very effectively. So it is always good to have that kind of thing. So it is there for you, right? Now, what happens when you add a Azure DNS, and we'll see soon that how that experience looks like. But let me show you quickly in the portal, since it is already open, how that experience may look like when you try to create a DNS zone. So let me go here and I try to create a DNS zone. Okay, and then I say that I'll say DNS, and then you can see that DNS zone comes in. I already have a DNS zone created, so let me create another one. And then if I choose a resource group, let's say I can choose any resource group. So Azure Private DNS Zone is a global resource, so it can act all throughout the subscription, across region, across tenants provided you have access to, and across resource groups, definitely. So I'll say that I'll choose the same resource group so it's easy to identify, and then I say that demo DNS. Okay, let me use my initials also so that it becomes a unique entity. Okay, so demo dnswg.com, and you can see that it's gonna go ahead and add that, right? So you can go ahead and create that. You can say private DNS zone, and it will give you some additional information. So if I go ahead and say I want to create a private DNS zone in this resource group called Azure Private DNS, and the name is private2g.com. Okay, and then I say next, next. It's gonna go ahead and kickstart a DNS process, which I'm gonna pause here for a moment and come back later. But I want to give you an idea about what exactly happens behind the scene. Okay, so let me switch to my whiteboard and then quickly draw something up for you in the whiteboard to really show you what exactly is happening behind the scene. Okay, so let me switch to the whiteboard, and then if I may go to the whiteboard and then start drawing over here, you will see that the concept is very clear. It's a very simple approach. Resources which are privately accessed can also enjoy the feature of DNS. That's the whole philosophy behind this setup, right? So that's why people use private DNS. Now imagine that you have got something like, let me create a private DNS. Now what happens, you have some VNet, okay? And inside this VNet, there could be a virtual machine, there could be an AKS clusters, node pool, and all other computer resources which can typically stay within a virtual network boundary lives here, right? Now, what happens is that you basically end up creating something like a auto register. So auto register does registration here. So it is automatically configured for auto registration. So what happens, you create a new resource, it gets a new private IP address. So let's say it is 10.0.0.4. Okay, that IP address gets registered to this DNS zone as a record. There are many different kind of record you can add also. Okay, and then you create one more resource. It could be an AKS cluster node pool node, and that can get 10.0.1.4, and that also gets an entry. So you get an entry here, you get an entry here automatically, right? That's called auto registration. So, and then you can have one-on-one mapping between a virtual network and a private DNS zone available in Azure. And I can't really differentiate like what kind of resources, what range of IP address you want to register. So everything which is part of this VNet, as soon as gets an IP address, will be registered to this, and it keeps on happening. This is sort of like a constant activity which keeps on happening behind the scene. Now, what happens if you give this name, let's say contoso.com. Now, your VM, let's say if you have a VM as a VM1, or this could be a VM2, can be identified as VM1 dot contoso.com, and another VM could be VM2 dot contoso.com. Now, if you recall the previous demo which we shared, the VM1 can also be called as internal dot cloudapp dot net. This still works, okay? But you can also call your VM much more effectively with some identifiable name, which is basically the name of the zone which you have created, and then say that I want to auto register with this VNet, and that's when this VNet can actually again correct. So you don't have to manually create those records. So that's the benefit, right? So as soon as there is a new IP, there is a new entry, and you are happy to work against with that. So let me show you an already created private DNS zone, uh, which basically is available in my Azure portal now, and you can pretty much create it by yourself and then attach a VNet. So let me quickly open my Azure portal, And if I can go to this, I'll open another window maybe. And if I just open the DNS zone here, you will be able to see that it has an ability to point to a virtual network. So let me go to the private DNS, and I should have a private DNS zone created, which is the name here should be this dnsprivate.com. You can have a good name, but you can see that I created two virtual machines, so both of them got registered here automatically because I have gotten connectivity here as a virtual network link. So it asks me what virtual network you want to link to this DNS zone. So you can just add a virtual network from your subscription. You can give a link name as demo 1, and then you can either choose a resource by ID because it allows you to pick up an ID from other subscription, so which is not visible probably over here. You can even see other subscription listed over here. You can pick up from there. Provided you have access to that, you can pretty much do that, or you can just dump the URL over here, and you can see that I have got to virtual network. One is the AKS virtual network. I can also associate here, or I can associate my previous. So it's already associated, right? So that's why you can see that all the resources getting created within this DNS zone are automatically getting registered. So moment I create a third VM, you will see a third entry, and on auto registered, you can see that it is showing you true. So let me now open my, let's say, console and reduce the size. If I now may ping a VM Ubuntu 1, not 1, and then the DNS zone name is dnsprivate.com. So if I can call this, all right, so let me see that it is, let me quickly check that out. Ping 10.0.0.4. Yeah, it is working, but ideally it should allow me to, let me quickly check that out. It's an interesting stuff, right? So if I may ping VM Ubuntu dot, it's not allowing me to do that, but ideally it should let me ping using the, so let me quickly check what is the configuration shows here. All right, so let me copy this whole thing. I need a dot. Maybe that could be one reason, because then it is not entering the dot. Yeah. So you need the following trailing dot. I dot identifies that it's the end of the statement. Otherwise, the browser, etc., ignore the dot and puts the dot by itself. Because it's a console, you need to provide the dot. And you can see that it is resolving the 10.0.0.4. That's the internal IP address of the VM, which is registered over there, right? Now you can call this VM into, ping this VM in two different ways. One is this, and another is um, internal.cloudapp.net. Now, if I may change this VM to VM2, this will actually now be pointing to 10.0.1.4, the other VM which is running over here. So you can now call the VM using either the internal automatic Azure DNS, which is without any configuration, without any private zone can work, or your private zone where you basically registered a virtual network, and you can, I think, register up to 100 virtual networks for auto registration. The one thing you need to remember that there should not be any IP conflict. That means the IP ranges should not overlap each other. If it does, then it is a problem. But otherwise, if you, let's say, completely design 100 virtual network within your Azure subscription, which is completely isolated, doesn't conflict with each other. You can pretty much have them all registered to one private DNS, and that will be registering all the resources getting created within that. So this is the internal Azure zone, or the Azure Private DNS zone, which can be created pretty quickly. Once it is created, you can just simply attach a virtual network and you are done, right? So there is no additional work required, and there is no manual activity required. You can see that pretty much in this DNS zone, these are all auto registered, so it's showing you the true. You can actually delete it, and I think it will come back again if you just delete it and then wait for some time. It should ideally come back after some time, or if it doesn't, just go ahead and add a record. You can say I want to manually add this record, and this is an A record, and then I name it as VM Ubuntu, let's say 3, let's say 3, and then DNS private this, and then I name this IP address as 10.0.0.4, and it's gonna go ahead and add this to the record. And now this time I can see that I'm gonna go ahead and get an IP address if I type this URL, right? So if I just go ahead and see what is that name, it is showing you this is a different name because I have manually entered that name. Just an IP mapping, right? So I can give any name. So I can say that I want to ping this, and I ping this, and then I enter, and it resolves to 10.0.0.4. It is basically pointing to, now just to stop here, it is pointing to the vmubu.internal.cloudapp.net. You can notice here that's the default behavior, which is pointing to this, and that's how the mapping and talking and the communicating with each other really works. And this is a very simple setup, and the most simplest one is the Azure public DNS zone, which I'm going to cover in my next video. But this is about the private DNS zone, and there are much more you can do inside that. If you want to really understand the internal, I would recommend that you should go ahead and check out the official documentation and check for more information. But this is absolutely almost no-brainer activity, which once you set up, and it works automatically, seamlessly, without any trouble or challenge. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful day.